Greetings, class. So we are continuing now with our unit on contemporary warrior identity. And we've been talking about a couple of things. We're talking about how after the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights era, the way that people justified war and imagined what people who fight wars are, those are things that have changed. And we see this in North America and in Europe. Similar events or similar things like this can also be seen in other places. Japan comes to mind, also Australia, among others. And we read Grossman and we saw how some people are really imagining people who fight wars to be an entirely different kind of person, someone who experiences the world in a way that's different than everyone else. The sheepdogs are different than the sheep, for example. Um, so the readings that I assigned for you this week sort of tie this together with some of the material that we read earlier on combat trauma. Note, for example, the work that we read on moral injury. We saw in Ken McLeish's article how he was kind of critical of the ways that the moral injury concept seemed to be creating kind of an alternate moral world for soldiers and maybe some other people to be able to participate in that operates according to different rules than what civilian people have to observe. So the two articles that I assigned for you this week were both written by veterans who are now scholars. Roy Scranton is an Army veteran who fought in the war in Iraq and is now a professor at Notre Dame. The other author is me, and as you know, I fought in the war in Afghanistan and am currently finishing my PhD at Duke. So what I gave you here was a concept presented by Scranton, and then an example from an experience that I had that sort of illustrates this concept that Scranton gives us. So I'm going to read sort of the important part, the early part of Scranton's article that we're working with here. Scranton says, every true war story is a story of trauma and recovery. A boy goes to war, his head full of romantic visions of glory, courage, and sacrifice, his heart yearning to achieve heroic deeds, but on the field of battle he finds only death and horror. He sees, suffers, and causes brutal and brutalizing violence. Such violence wounds the soldier's very soul. After the war, the boy, now a veteran and a man, returns to the world of peace haunted by his experience, racked by the central compulsion of trauma and atrocity, the struggle between the need to bear witness to this shattering encounter with violence and the compulsion to repress it. The veteran tries to make sense of his memory but finds it all but impossible. Most people don't want to hear the awful truths that the war has taught them. The political powers that be want to cover up the shocking reality of war, and anybody who wasn't there simply can't understand what it was like. The truth of war, the veteran comes to learn, is a truth beyond words, a truth that can only be known by having been there, an unspeakable truth he must bear for society. And so goes the myth of the trauma hero. This myth informs our politics, shapes our news reports, and underwrites our history. It dominates critical and scholarly interpretation of war literature, war movies, and the visual culture of war. It shapes how we understand Iraq, Afghanistan, Vietnam, and World War II, and it affects whom we vote for. Like all myths, this story frames and filters our perceptions of reality through a set of recognizable and comforting conventions. It works to convince us that war is a special kind of experience that offers a special kind of truth, a truth that gives those who have been there a special kind of authority. The trauma hero myth also serves a scapegoat function, discharging national blood guilt by substituting the victim of trauma, the soldier, for the victim of violence, the enemy. So from there, Scranton goes on to talk about American Sniper. We talked about this film last week, the story of Chris Kyle and such, and I don't think that I need to say too much more about that. I also assigned you an illustration of Scranton's concept through an article that I wrote about an experience that I had. I wrote about my grandfather's funeral. My grandfather was a World War II veteran, and I was close to him when I was a kid. As I stated in the article, my closeness with my grandfather was in a lot of ways based on the role that he played in my life after my father left when I was a kid. After I got back from war, I spent some more time with him. He was in remarkable physical shape, well into his late 90s, and he continued to work in the woods. And for some time after I got out of the military, I spent some time with him there. Until just a few years back, he slowed down and then died pretty much from old age, just shy of turning 99 years old. I realized that when I spent time with my grandfather after I got back from war, the very patriotic people in my family kind of projected this trauma hero archetype onto us. They imagined that the bond that we had was based on our shared experience of combat and combat trauma 60 years apart. As described by Scranton, many people think of this as having a truth beyond words. And at my grandfather's funeral, I was disappointed to see that all that anyone could talk about with him was military service. All of the pictures that they had hung up were of him in uniform. There were flags everywhere. They played patriotic music. I was trying to find some sign of the person underneath all of that stuff, and I couldn't find it. And the alienation that I was experiencing was visible to the people who were there. And I wrote that my social performance at that funeral failed. I shared the scene where like this scene that you see in a lot of war movies when someone dies. There was a full military funeral for my grandfather. I was sort of standing on the outside of the field while they were playing taps and all that, and I saw people looking at me, and I was like, they want me to salute his grave, and I didn't do that, and that was disappointing. It would have been comforting to them for me to perform my own patriotism and to package our relationship into what Scranton calls a comforting convention. It would be disappointing, perhaps, for everyone who had put military service on such a pedestal to know how little that all of that military stuff really had to do with my relationship with my grandfather. Was it a big part of our lives? Yes, it was. Was it this truth beyond words that defined the relationship we had? No, it wasn't. We didn't really talk about it that much. It wasn't, and not because we were too traumatized to talk about it. I mean, we had actually shared some of those stories with each other, but it wasn't. It just really wasn't that big of a part of the relationship that we had, and the way that people imagined this thing to be. People felt like I was, continuing his military legacy by going in the military and all that. I think I mentioned in the article that my grandfather was actually disappointed when I volunteered for infantry duty. He would have preferred that I'd chosen an easier and less dangerous job. He tried to talk me out of it, and he, I don't think I should say he wasn't proud of me, but he thought that, that was kind of an unwise decision that I made, and he didn't understand why in the world I would choose to do that. And that's what some of those conversations had. And after I was wounded in combat, sometimes he said, "I told you so," for going into that infantry stuff, is what he used to say, which I don't think is the kind of conversation that people imagined that we were having when we talked about the military. I'm going to go ahead and cut myself off there. The works I assigned to you and ones like them are part of a public conversation that's going on about war and how we understand it. And as usual, I'm not trying to tell you what you're supposed to think about these things, the things that I assigned to you to read. But I look forward to hearing what you do think about them. And I look forward to seeing you on Friday. Take care.